This is Warpspeed, released in 1993 for the Sega Genesis courtesy of Accolade, which means you've got these obnoxious cartridges that stand tall above all the other Genesis carts, and, well, I guess you have to compensate somehow, but I digress. Warpspeed is a space combat simulator where you control a little ship and you partake on various missions, usually consisting of blowing up every trace of bad guy in space. Sometimes you have to contend with side missions such as fighting rival foes, defending bases, attacking enemy carriers, and other bits and bobs, but for the most part your main goal involves killing bad guys and living long enough to tell tall tales about your exploits. As you defeat foes and complete side missions, you'll earn points, and earning enough points will net you promotions, medals, and perhaps more importantly, more versatile craft, such as it is. There are a number of individual missions for you to partake in, which changes the number of quadrants that you'll have to navigate, as well as other conditions such as lack of long-range sensors and things of that nature. You could choose to partake in any of the missions on screen. None of them are connected in any way. They're all standalone, which means once the mission is completed, or once you exhaust all your continues, the credits pop up and it's back to the opening logos and title screen. And if you do win missions, none of your progress carries over to other missions. The only exception to this rule is if you partake in a campaign comprising 4 random missions, of which you can use passwords to resume the campaign at a later time. Immediately jumping into this, I'm reminded of another space combat simulator gracing the Nintendo Entertainment System called Destination Earthstar, a game that had a similar premise going for it, but hardware limitations pretty much curtailed whatever potential the idea may have. The overall premise and design of Warpspeed feels very similar to that Destination Earthstar game, but somewhat expanded beyond that game's scope and omitting the rather flawed side-scrolling bits. And while I will admit that Warpspeed fares a bit better on the Genesis than Destination Earthstar did on the NES, there are also aspects of Warpspeed that actually feels worse than the unrelated Nintendo game. Blasphemous, I'm sure. It's worth noting that Warpspeed does have a bit of a learning curve in regards to learning its controls, which may be a barrier of entry that might turn off some players. Much like in Destination Earthstar, or to use a more direct comparison, Wing Commander when that game was ported over to the Super Nintendo, the game requires you to learn button combinations for various functions. For example, holding down start while pressing up or down on the D-pad controls your ship's speed. In order to engage your ship's warp drive capability, you'll need to bring up your scanner with the C button and hold down start in order to move the cursor to the sector you want to go to. And then you hold down start, tap up twice on the D-pad to go to warp, and to pause the game you'll need to hold start and press C while in the cockpit. Holding start while pressing A swaps targets for missile purposes, while button B switches missiles if your ship has any in stock. So that's quite a bit to digest, and after a while you do start to get the hang of it, maybe, kind of, sort of. But it does feel somewhat cumbersome, and unfortunately this game was apparently conceived before the 6-button gamepad became a thing on the Mega Drive, which is a shame because this is a game that would have greatly benefited from all those extra buttons, much like the equivalent Super Nintendo version of the same game. Yeah, this game was also on the Super Nintendo. We're not playing that one though. For most missions in Warpspeed, you start off with a woefully underpowered and under-equipped starfighter, armed with only the slowest firing photon cannons in the universe. This makes dogfights with enemy fighters a somewhat protracted affair if they were even remotely functional. But one of the things that hurts Warpspeed is the piss-poor collision detection. Hits don't register when your shots touch the target like any other space sim would. They register when they hit the space in front of or behind your opponent. When an enemy is flying at you, this is perhaps the only time you can aim your shots and get some hits in, because once the ship starts moving all over the place, landing your shots is based more on dumb luck than any semblance of precision accuracy. The weapons you're given in this game are also something of an anomaly. Typically, in most spaceflight games, your main blasters are supposed to be quick shooting and easy to aim. You just have to aim correctly in order to land your shots on the target, and more often than not, you'll land your hits. Even Destination Earthstar had laser cannons that fired fast shots, and the collision detection was pretty spot on for the most part. But because Warpspeed's collision detection is the drizzling shits, and because your blaster shots are slow moving, shots that should hit at point blank range somehow don't, and trying to shoot down a pursuing vessel is a pipe dream at best because your shots are just too damn slow. Even the homing missiles that you get on later vessels only seem effective half the time. It's probably for this reason why Warpspeed is rather lacking in the mission variety. Your main goal in each mission, as previously stated, is to seek out all enemy ships and destroy them. and that's about it. The only thing that really changes in the various mission parameters are the number of quadrants you could warp from, the number of wormholes that allow you to travel between quadrants, the type of opposition, and whether your long-range sensors work or not. There are side missions and challenges that may pop up every so often that you can complete for bonus points, which helps in the upgrades and stuff, but these happen within the main missions and are completely optional affairs. And the main missions take a good while to complete, especially those spanning 8 or so quadrants for you to explore. And quite honestly, there's no need to attempt a campaign in this game, even if the option is available. The main standalone missions that you could pick from on the main menu are more than enough warp speed for your playing pleasures. Once you've played one mission in its entirety, you've pretty much played them all, and trying to play through all the missions is an exercise in tedium, and coupled with the sluggish weapons and mediocre hit detection, makes warp speed more of a chore that you endure rather than a game you play. Even the fighters you fly feel the same. Other than ornaments and cockpit display, there's no discernible difference in speed, handling, and defenses between the lightest fighter you start off with and the heaviest fighter with the most weapons. It's just, here are some extra guns, which don't seem all that different from each other despite having different names, which ultimately feels rather pointless. Suddenly, Destination Earthstar on the NES seems like a much better game in comparison. The collision works, the weapons work, and quite honestly, the warp drive effect is better in that game than it is here. I mean, what's this purple blob stuff? I mean, ugh. With that having been said, warp speed does look somewhat adequate, at best at least. I like that the 4 fighters you fly each have their own cockpits, though I'm sure some would prefer no cockpit for additional visibility, but this is a nice touch regardless. The scaling of the asteroids and the starbase you dock with are rather smooth, but the enemy fighters, not so much. Even the enemy carrier that launches ships never appears more than a little tiny thing that takes several hits to die. The designs of the actual fighters are alright, nothing special I suppose. The mugshots during the communiques aren't too bad looking, it's alright, it's just not great, I guess. I do like the wormhole effect, as simplistic as it may be. It's a nice little thing. Meanwhile, the overall sound quality in Warpspeed is very lackluster. A game like this should have a somewhat impactful soundtrack to get you in the mood for some spacefaring and some pirate blasting and things of that nature, and instead you get these woefully composed melodies that sound like they were composed by 3-year-olds. And the instrumentation used to compose these wonderful songs? Just tremendous. Oh, and the sound effects are kind of meh, blah, forgettable, not worth mentioning. Except I already did, so whatever. You know, I hate to use that old reviewing cliche, but I actually wanted to like Warpspeed. I like the idea, I like the concept, I like the way this game is set up, I like the approach, the ambition to try and make a space sim on the Genesis, but when it came to the actual execution, the actual playing of the video game, it fell below the mark to such a degree that I got more mileage and enjoyment out of a space sim on a much inferior console, which is not a high point because Destination Earthstar has its own problems. There are a lot of issues with warp speed that has been mentioned before. The collision detection, the slow weapons, the tedium, the nothing's really special. But if these were fixed and worked around, then you could have had an engaging little space sim game on the Genesis. As it is, Warpspeed is a game running on fumes and will never make it so. Nobody is going to get that. That's probably for the best.